What if a dead machine began to speak? On the 3rd of November, just after midnight, the low hum of cooling fans was the only sound inside a sterile, windowless signals intelligence facility. Analyst Thorne watched lines of code scroll endlessly across her monitor when a single crimson flag bloomed, an anomaly from a server long thought dormant. The transmission lasted a mere 1.7 seconds. It was a ghost, an unauthorized data burst from a system that was supposed to be a digital tomb, air-gapped and silent. The packet was wrapped in layers of encryption so dense and unfamiliar, it actively seemed to shift its structure, a knot tied by a phantom. This wasn't just a system glitch, it was a deliberate whisper from a place that had no voice. How could a system, meticulously cataloged as inert and physically disconnected, suddenly scream into the digital void? The initial alarm was quiet, a low-level hum of procedural concern rather than a blaring siren of crisis. It was logged and categorized by the automated system as a type gamma anomaly, a rare designation for events so statistically improbable they bordered on the impossible. For now, it was just a puzzle, a single frayed thread in a vast tapestry of global data flow. Thorne tagged the file, adding a single concise note: origin unknown, intent hostile. The web expands. In our hyper-connected world, we build digital empires on foundations of old code and forgotten servers. These digital catacombs are not as dead as we believe, and their ghosts can be awakened with a single stray command, threatening the very stability we take for granted. The first decryption attempts produced only static, a digital roar of meaningless characters that overloaded the diagnostic algorithms. But deep within that cryptographic noise, a faint repeating sequence began to emerge, a structured, non-random pulse that suggested not chaos, but a carefully hidden message waiting for the right key.
What is the weight of a single keystroke? Before the ghost in the machine spoke its first word, before that midnight communique spooled on the analyst's screen, a betrayal had already occurred. Treason is a word that echoes with ancient gravity. It speaks of gallows and firing squads. The Constitution defines it narrowly: levying war against the United States or adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. It requires an overt act, a witness. But the architecture of betrayal has been redrawn in our hyper-connected age. The overt act is no longer a sword raised on a battlefield. Shadows shift. Imagine a programmer in a quiet suburban home, the only light coming from the blue glow of a monitor. Outside, sprinklers hiss across a manicured lawn. Inside, with the gentle tap of a finger on an enter key, a nation's most guarded secrets hemorrhage into the dark web, sold not for a cause, but for cryptocurrency. This is the mercenary spy, a figure as old as statecraft itself, now cloaked in digital anonymity. Their motive is simple greed. The act, however, is a profound rupture of the social contract, a severing of trust for personal gain. It is a clean, cold, and final transaction of faith for fortune. But what if the motive is not money, but belief? In an era where borders are porous and ideologies are global, to whom does one truly owe allegiance? The ideological traitor sees themselves not as a villain, but as a patriot for a different, higher cause. They leak documents to expose perceived injustices, convinced their loyalty belongs to humanity, not a flag. Their betrayal is a moral crusade in their own mind, a complicated act of conscience that blurs the line between whistleblower and enemy agent. The web unravels. This distinction is the central battleground where modern loyalty is contested and lost.
Understanding this anatomy of betrayal is no mere academic exercise. It is fundamental to our security today, as digital ghosts and weaponized information now shape our geopolitical reality. The analyst, staring at the impossible data stream, knew this wasn't just a system breach, it was a statement, a wound. And so we must ask not only what was sent in that midnight communique, but what broken loyalty, what fractured belief compelled the sender to press the key. Some minds are not built for comfort, but for the cold calculus of truth. When the midnight communique arrived, the true alarm wasn't its content, but its ghost-like signature, a signal born from a patient betrayal, leaving no trace. This was a problem for Evelyn Reed. They called her when the digital shadows grew too deep. At 3 in the morning, in an office smelling of stale coffee and ozone, she traced patterns across glowing monitors. She was the agency's cartographer of secrets, a woman who deciphered the human frailties hidden within code, seeing the invisible architecture connecting seemingly random events. For her, data was a symphony, and she could hear a single instrument playing out of tune. She wasn't looking at words, but at the spaces between, the timing of the packets, the subtle heartbeat of the code itself. This relentless focus came at a price. Friendships frayed, the world outside her work faded. But how can you map the intricate anatomy of betrayal if you are distracted by the noise of ordinary life? She believed every secret had a signature, the complex web. The ghost that spoke on the 3rd of November had one. It was just impossibly faint. In an age of algorithmic warfare, this is why her skills remain indispensable. Technology can be fooled, but human patterns are far more stubborn. She saw something the initial analysts dismissed as mere system noise, a flicker in the metadata, a deliberate imperfection in an otherwise flawless piece of work.
For Evelyn Reed, this was no simple technical error. It was a breadcrumb. It was the first thread of a conspiracy that reached far deeper and into darker places than anyone at the agency had yet dared to imagine. How does a dead program leave a digital fingerprint 12 years later? For Evelyn Reed, sifting through the communiqué's architecture, the answer was a single chilling name: Project Nightingale. The encryption key wasn't just similar, it was a perfect spectral match to a ghost she thought long buried. 12 years ago, in a windowless server farm buried deep beneath the Virginia hills, a programmer watched streams of private data flow across his monitor. He wasn't tracking terrorists, he was mapping the quiet anxieties of a nation, one grocery list and late-night search query at a time. Project Nightingale was the government's secret ear, an ambitious and illegal domestic surveillance program designed to listen to everything. It wasn't about finding a needle in a haystack, its purpose was to own the haystack itself. It correlated emails, phone calls, and financial transactions, weaving them into predictive behavioral models. The goal wasn't just to stop threats, but to identify the very patterns of thought that might one day lead to dissent. It was a breathtaking act of hubris, officially shuttered after a spectacular public scandal exposed its vast unconstitutional reach, a casualty of its own ambition. Unraveling shadows. And yet here was its key. The cryptographic signature that secured the midnight communiqué was Nightingale's unique digital DNA, a complex, multi-layered cipher believed to have been digitally shredded and physically destroyed along with the program's servers. It was a key that should not exist, a key that could not be replicated without access to the original classified source architecture. But if a program is truly dismantled, are its tools, its algorithms, its very soul also erased from existence?
This wasn't just an old piece of code resurfacing by accident. This was a deliberate act, an echo with a clear, malevolent intent. Reed understood the chilling implication immediately, the cold logic clicking into place. Either a deeply buried faction had resurrected the ghost of Nightingale from its digital grave, or the official story of its death was the most profound lie of all. The furious debate over digital privacy and government overreach didn't end with Nightingale's public disgrace. It merely learned to hide in plain sight, changing its name and its interface, whispering new justifications for watching. The ghost now had a name, a history of betrayal etched into its very code. But a ghost always needs a master, a human hand to guide its now invisible and terrifying work. How do you hunt a ghost that leaves no digital tracks? Project Nightingale's signal led not to a person, but to the cold of Sub-Basement 4. Evelyn Reed stood before the silent server, the air thick with chilled ozone. The source was a black mirror, its drive wiped with a military-grade 7-pass algorithm, a digital scorched earth policy. This was not deletion, it was the methodical annihilation of history by an expert, a complex web. Forensics began its digital archaeology. They were not looking for a file, but for the magnetic ghost of a single bit, an echo on the drive's physical platter. They sifted terabytes of noise for a whisper of data. But how do you reconstruct a message when all you have is a single shattered syllable of data? They found it,
A lone corrupted file fragment, barely 4 kilobytes in size, a needle in a burned haystack. The ghost had, it seemed, made a mistake. The fragment was a puzzle. Data carving revealed metadata, not a message, a timestamp microseconds off from the communique, and a sliver of an encryption key. The key was the revelation. It resembled Nightingale's old protocols, but was fundamentally different, more evolved.
The ghost was building new weapons from old bones. This level of digital tradecraft, once the domain of nation-states, now shapes our reality by erasing corporate records or rewriting political narratives overnight. Our own histories can be wiped clean. The perfect wipe was unsettling, the single file more so. It felt less like an error and more like a deliberate gesture, a taunt left for them to find. For Evelyn Reed, this changed the profile of her quarry entirely. She was no longer hunting a panicked trader who covered their tracks. She was pursuing a master architect. The corrupted file was not the ghost's mistake. It was a breadcrumb left behind, leading them somewhere far more dangerous than a server room. They think they are hunting a ghost. They are merely following my map. From the quiet of his study, the city's distant hum was a constant, ignorable presence. He traced the rim of a cold porcelain cup, the faint scent of tea grounding him as he watched the internal reports flicker across a dark screen. The panic was predictable, the escalation inevitable. They have dispatched their finest bloodhound, Evelyn Reed. A brilliant mind, yes, but one conditioned by the very system I seek to dismantle. Her talent is not a threat, it is the primary gear in my machine. She sees the communique from Project Nightingale as a resurrected failure, a loose thread from the past. She pulls on it with all her formidable intellect, unwinding the spool exactly as intended. How could they not see it? Did they truly believe a program dead for 12 years would reawaken by pure chance? Their arrogance is their greatest vulnerability. They built a fortress of protocols and firewalls, but they forgot that the most secure system can be turned inside out by a single, perfectly placed assumption. They are reacting to a phantom, a digital echo I crafted to mimic their worst fears. The web tightens.
This is the nature of modern power, not brute force, but subtle, irresistible influence. In a world drowning in information, true control lies in authoring the narrative, in curating the discovery. You do not hide the needle, you build the perfect haystack around it. Evelyn Reed now descends into Sub-Basement 4, searching for a traitor. She will find precisely what I left her to find. What is left when a digital ghost finally whispers a name? For days, Evelyn Reed's forensics team wrestled with the corrupted fragment from Sub-Basement 4. In a room smelling of stale coffee and hot electronics, they sifted through a blizzard of digital noise for a signal. Then, late on the 4th night, a single coherent string of data bloomed on the monitor. 2 words: Arthur Finch. It wasn't a code or a command. It was a name, the first solid handhold on a wall of smooth, featureless ice. The ghost from Project Nightingale had finally, after 12 silent years, identified one of its own. The name was a key, but the lock was a decade old and rusted shut. The initial search for Arthur Finch yielded an unnerving nothingness. No social media, no recent credit history, no digital footprint. It was as if he had stepped off the grid the day Nightingale was decommissioned. Intelligence databases were a dead end. The project's personnel files were heavily redacted, his contributions classified under impenetrable layers of silence. For Evelyn Reed, the silence itself was the loudest clue, a carefully constructed void where a man used to be. But how do you find a man who has spent a decade perfecting the art of being forgotten? A shadow shifts. The hunt became an exercise in digital archaeology, digging through forgotten servers and dusty physical archives for any trace. The breakthrough came not from a sophisticated algorithm, but from a mundane piece of paper. A cross-referenced federal pension log buried in a sub-archive listed a forwarding address in rural Vermont.
Arthur Finch wasn't a fugitive hiding in the shadows. He was a retiree living in deliberate obscurity. The man who held a key to the conspiracy was, on paper, just another citizen collecting his government check. This simple truth highlights a profound reality of our age. Our digital pasts are never truly erased, merely archived, waiting for the right key to unlock them. The complex web tightens around its first human node. The Watcher's path had led them directly to this quiet town. The ghost had pointed the way, but what secrets does a retired cryptographer take with him into the quiet of the mountains? And more importantly, why is he being summoned now? How do you question a man who believes words are traps? Evelyn Finch found Arthur Finch in a place where time had simply decayed. The air in the sterile room tasted of dust and forgotten files. His teacup rattled against its saucer, a tremor born of something other than the cold. He was a ghost long before the one in Sub-Basement 4 began to speak, a relic of a past she was only beginning to comprehend, an archive of secrets he was clearly terrified to open. Her questions about Project Nightingale were met with a dry, rustling laugh. "Nightingale," he rasped, his voice thin as parchment. "You chase a songbird while the serpent coils beneath the floorboards." He spoke in maddening circles of foundational cracks and sins of the past, his eyes darting toward the corners of the room as if expecting shadows to take form. He was a lock, and she had brought the wrong key, a blunt instrument for a delicate lock. The complex web. She pressed, mentioning the ghost signal from the communique. Finch flinched. "It remembers," he whispered, "the original sin." Was this the brilliant architect from the files, or the wreckage his creation left behind? His fear was not of her. It was of a truth she was unwittingly disturbing, an old wound she was tearing open with every single pointed query.
The sins of old code, decisions made in haste more than a decade ago, echo in the systems we trust today. A foundational crack never truly heals. It only waits for the right pressure to split everything apart. Finch was not just a source, he was a living testament to that dangerous, inherent fragility. He offered no names, only a final, chilling piece of advice. Stop looking at the betrayal. Look at what was betrayed. He had given her not a map, but a stark warning. The true ghost was never in the machine, but within its very blueprints. How do you find a shadow that leaves no trace? Finch's words echoed in Reed's mind. The quiet. Back in her office, the city slept outside her window, but inside, the only light was the cold blue of her monitor. The air tasted of burnt coffee, and the low hum of the servers was a constant companion as she abandoned the search for a singular, catastrophic breach. Finch had given her a new lens. She wasn't looking for an explosion anymore. She was listening for a whisper. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with renewed purpose. She expanded the search parameters from a single day to 18 months. The query was unorthodox. She wasn't flagging unauthorized access or massive data transfers. Instead, she was hunting for ghosts, single kilobyte diversions, routing errors that corrected themselves in milliseconds, and pings to dormant, forgotten network backdoors. These were the system's quiet coughs, the digital anomalies everyone had dismissed as benign system noise. The results began to populate the screen, not as a blaring alarm, but as a faint constellation of pinpricks. Each one alone was meaningless, a rounding error, but when overlaid on a timeline, a structure emerged. A delicate, terrifyingly intricate web stretched across the entire network infrastructure. The quiet pattern. It connected secure servers to mundane administrative nodes, all through long decommissioned pathways.
Could a system so meticulously designed, so patient in its execution, be a product of anything but a guiding intelligence? This wasn't a smash and grab, it was a slow bleed, an infiltration so subtle it became part of the background hum. It's the new face of espionage, where the goal isn't to break down the door, but to be invited inside, one forgotten key at a time. The web wasn't just evidence of a breach. Evelyn realized with a growing sense of dread that the pattern was a map, but it was a map drawn by the Watcher, and she had no idea where it led.
What if the greatest treason is born not from greed, but from love? The search for the Watcher on the Hill had assumed a simple motive: money, blackmail, or revenge. But Arthur Finch's warnings pointed toward a more complex engine. He sat in a basement apartment in Bonn, 1972, the thin wire of his headset a direct line to a new world. The voice was not a commander, but a fellow believer, speaking of a history that needed correcting, a higher loyalty. This is the anatomy of the ideological traitor, a figure who redraws the entire map of allegiance, not for a paycheck, but for a principle. They see their betrayal not as a crime, but as a moral imperative. For them, the nation-state is a temporary, flawed vessel. Their true citizenship belongs to an idea, a global proletariat, a borderless faith, a pure form of democracy they believe their own government has corrupted. This conviction acts as an impenetrable shield against guilt. It reframes espionage as righteous work. But when does unwavering belief curdle into fanaticism, justifying any action in service of a perceived greater good? This is the question Evelyn Reed now faces. She isn't hunting a simple spy selling secrets. She is hunting a true prophet. This kind of conviction is not a relic of the Cold War. It echoes in the fractured loyalties of our own time, where digital tribes and global causes often command more devotion than a flag.
Understanding this motive is the key to predicting the Watcher's endgame. He is not trying to enrich himself. He is trying to remake the world according to his own shadowed blueprint. And Reed knows that to stop him, she must first unravel the one thing more dangerous than a state secret: a sincere, world-altering belief. What happens when a ghost finally points towards its master? After 12 grueling hours of circular denials, Arthur Finch finally broke. He whispered a name, a key to the entire machinery of Project Nightingale: Julian Thorne. Thorne wasn't just another analyst. He was the architect, Finch's superior, the man who held the blueprints and gave the orders. For Evelyn Reed, this wasn't just a lead. It was a seismic shift in the investigation, pulling the past violently into the present. The first name was a pawn. The second was a king. Public records painted Thorne as a prodigy, a charismatic operator who navigated the corridors of power with unnerving ease. Imagine him in the spring of 2009, standing at a podium under the harsh glare of television lights, deftly deflecting questions about clandestine programs with a disarming smile. The polished mahogany reflected his impeccable suit, his words a symphony of plausible deniability. He was the acceptable face of an unacceptable reality, a man who sold shadows as security. The quiet deepens. Then came the fall. When Project Nightingale imploded, the scandal was immense, a firestorm of public outrage and congressional inquiries. Julian Thorne was at its epicenter. He was publicly censured, his celebrated career left in ruins on the front pages of every major newspaper. But while others, like Finch, paid a steep price, Thorne walked away. No charges, no trial, no testimony. How does the chief architect of a disaster escape the wreckage without a single scratch? His official file ends abruptly, sealed under a national security directive that felt more like a shield than a sanction.
This disappearing act is a chillingly modern parable. It speaks to a level of influence that operates above the law, where public disgrace is merely a costume to be shed before retreating into a deeper, more permanent shadow. The powerful don't just evade justice, they can erase themselves from the very narrative of their own crimes. Evelyn Reed now understood the true nature of Finch's fear. It wasn't about what Nightingale did, it was about who had commanded it. The hunt for a digital ghost had suddenly become the hunt for a man who had mastered the art of becoming invisible, a man who, for all intents and purposes, no longer existed. The question was no longer what happened, but where is Julian Thorne now? What is the price of a man's silence? For Arthur Finch, it was precisely calculated. Reed's analyst pointed at the screen in the sterile lab, the only sound a low hum. Columns of numbers traced a path from a Cayman Shell Corporation to a Virginia savings account. The deposits were clockwork, the third of each month for a decade. This was not the bank record of a retired civil servant. It was a retainer, a payment for services withheld. Finch, the reluctant oracle who spoke of ideological purity, was on a payroll. The name Julian Thorne was no longer a simple clue. It was a commodity, an asset to be deployed. Every word Finch had spoken to Evelyn Reed was now tainted. His warnings about the Watcher on the Hill, his cryptic pronouncements on loyalty, all cast in the cold, transactional light of these offshore payments. He was not a victim trapped in the system. He was a component, a gear oiled by anonymous cash, the complex web. If his silence had a price, what was the value of the single name he finally offered? This is how dark money turns keepers of secrets into gatekeepers of lies. The integrity of our institutions often hinges on loyalties we discover, far too late, have already been sold.
For Reed, the discovery was a paradigm shift, forcing her to re-examine every assumption. Finch was no longer a simple source. He was a compromised asset, a living piece of disinformation. The investigation had not found a key, it had found a lockbox with a false bottom. The money trail went cold in the Caribbean, a digital dead end. But the question it raised was louder than any alarm. Who was paying Arthur Finch, and what other, darker secrets were they still trying to bury? How do you find a man who has unwritten his own existence? An analyst in a darkened room, illuminated only by a monitor, taps a final key. The screen flashes back the same sterile response: no records found. It was the same for federal tax ledgers, international travel manifests, and even municipal utility bills. Julian Thorne wasn't just missing, he had been professionally, methodically erased from the present day. The digital breadcrumbs Evelyn Reed's team expected to follow had been swept clean. For 5 years, he had left no electronic signature, not one credit card swipe for a cup of coffee, no automated toll payments on a forgotten highway, no errant cell phone pinging off a rural tower in the dead of night. He had become a ghost in the very machine he helped to build, a phantom who understood its every weakness and blind spot. How can a man once so integral to the system simply unplug himself from the entire global network without a single traceable error? The search in the physical world proved just as fruitless, an echo in an empty room. His last known address was tied to a shell corporation that dissolved 4 years and 11 months ago, its legal paperwork a masterclass in obfuscation. The paper trail didn't just end, it vanished into a shredder, and then, presumably, an incinerator. His known associates from Project Nightingale were either silenced like Arthur Finch, or had similarly vanished into the ether.
This wasn't the work of a fugitive hiding in the shadows. It was the meticulous architecture of a man who controlled them. In an age where every click and purchase is recorded, his disappearance is a chilling testament that true anonymity is still possible, but only for those with the discipline and resources to achieve it. A complex web. For Evelyn Reed, this wasn't just a setback, it was a direct, taunting message. The Watcher on the Hill was demonstrating his capabilities, showing them the absolute futility of their chase. The trail forward had gone cold, a perfect void of data and dead ends. But if a man erases his future so completely, perhaps the only clues left are buried deep within the past he tried to escape. How does a dead man's silence become a foreign state's investment? In a sterile room, an analyst on Reed's team traced Arthur Finch's final payment. It was the last of 124 microdeposits from a shell company on an island of corporate ghosts. The layering was too clean for a common criminal. It was the meticulous signature of state tradecraft, a true ghost in the ledger. The patterns pointed to an intelligence service known not for brute force, but for its geological patience. Their doctrine was to cultivate assets over decades, nurturing ideological sympathy before making any request. They moved money like moisture through rock, using dozens of entities to obscure the true source. How do you prove a state's intent when every individual action is utterly deniable? A complex web. The breakthrough was a name buried in the documents of a holding company, Evelyn Reed Ventures. The firm funding Finch had a board member linked to a cultural exchange program, a known front for a foreign intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover. It wasn't a smoking gun, but a deliberately placed, arrogant breadcrumb. This patient financial infiltration is a cornerstone of modern hybrid warfare.
The battle is fought with spreadsheets, not soldiers. The discovery changed everything. The Watcher was no lone wolf. Julian Thorne, no disgruntled patriot.
They were pieces in a geopolitical chess game that had been playing out for over a decade. The motive was not simply exposure. It was about leverage, patiently acquired and held in reserve. The money trail confirmed foreign involvement, but it also revealed something more disturbing. The payments to Finch didn't stop when he was silenced. They were redirected. How does an investigation turn into an inquisition? That foreign connection, confirmed through Arthur Finch's meticulously laundered payments, was the tripwire. The problem wasn't a ghost in a dead machine anymore. It was a traitor in the living ranks. The enemy was no longer outside the gates. He was inside the citadel itself. The investigation's very nature had fundamentally shifted. Resources, once scarce, now flowed without limit. But with them came a new kind of pressure, a suffocating oversight from superiors who feared scandal more than espionage. The complex web. Evelyn Reed sat at a 30-foot mahogany table, the air chilled to an unnatural cold. Across the polished surface, 3 deputy directors watched her, their silence a weapon far more potent than any question. They wanted containment, not the truth. This wasn't about national security anymore. It was about damage control. A quiet surgical excision was required, with no headlines and no political fallout. The mission was no longer to unravel a mystery, but to bury a body before it began to smell.
After all, if a man like Arthur Finch could be turned, who was truly incorruptible? Colleagues eyed one another with suspicion. Every friendly conversation, every shared coffee was retroactively scanned for hidden meaning. The machinery of counterintelligence ground to life. It was a slow, impersonal beast. Security clearances were re-examined, polygraph tests were scheduled, financial records and communication logs were dissected with an amoral algorithmic precision. Evelyn Reed, once the hunter, now felt the chilling possibility of becoming the hunted. This internal corrosion remains the greatest fear of modern intelligence services. The most significant breaches of the 21st century have rarely come from sophisticated cyber attacks, but from a trusted employee with a conscience, a grudge, or a price. The real danger is the quiet betrayal from within. The first wave of automated audits was complete. A server in a secure room, humming with cold purpose, processed terabytes of personnel data, flagging statistical outliers. The hunt had its first map. The machine printed a list of names, and the first shadow was about to be given a face. How do you catch a man who was already caught years ago? The mole hunt for Julian Thorne assumed a recent betrayal. The truth was older, deeper, a ghost now walking the halls of Evelyn Reed's investigation. At a Geneva reception in 2008, the air was thick with polite lies and the scent of expensive perfume. A young, ambitious Julian Thorne sipped his champagne, feeling the weight of being utterly overlooked. He was a junior attaché with grand ideas, completely invisible to the power brokers he so desperately wanted to join. Then she appeared. Her interest wasn't political, it was personal, intellectual. She saw the brilliance he knew he possessed. The hook was baited not with secrets or money, but with the one thing he could not resist, a reflection of the man he desperately wanted to be.
Over weeks, the flattery was subtle, tailored to his specific insecurities and professional frustrations. His ego, so long starved of recognition, was a willing accomplice. Was it a weakness of character, or simply the predictable physics of ambition meeting opportunity? The compromise was never a single dramatic moment. It was a slow, gentle turning, a series of small concessions and shared confidences until the line between colleague and handler simply dissolved. He was helping a friend. He was being recognized. He was, finally, important. Unraveled shadows. These classic playbooks of psychological recruitment remain devastatingly effective, amplified by digital footprints that make identifying a target's deepest vanities easier than ever. The honeypot has moved from the embassy party to the private message inbox. The trap had been sprung, the asset secured. But Thorne was never the final target. He was merely the first key, designed to unlock a far more important door. What if the most dangerous weapon is not a bullet, but a handshake? For years, Julian Thorne's true work was not espionage, but administration.
In a wood-paneled office smelling of old paper and polish, a director signed the promotion for Marcus Vance, Thorne's nominee. The signature was a simple act of bureaucratic trust, a routine approval for a promising man. It was also the placement of another piece on a board no one else knew existed. Thorne's conspiracy was never about sudden, violent acts of sabotage. It was a slow, patient infection of its arteries. He didn't break the institution. He hollowed it out from deep inside, filling the voids with people loyal not to country, but to his cause. The complex web. This network operated in the quiet spaces between decisions, a ghost in the machine of governance. They didn't leak intelligence, they curated it, ensuring certain reports landed on top of the pile, while inconvenient truths were buried deep in footnotes.
They didn't veto policies, they amended them with subtle clauses that altered their fundamental intent. How can you fight an enemy who wears your own uniform and speaks with your own voice? This was the horrifying realization dawning on Evelyn Reed's team. They weren't just hunting one man, but a phantom government operating in the shadows of the real one. This weaponization of trust is not a relic of Cold War spycraft. It remains the modern playbook for subversion, eroding faith by making institutions betray their purpose from within. The mole hunt had focused on finding one ghost, Julian Thorne himself. But as the investigation deepened, they understood the truth. The real threat wasn't the man they were looking for, but the silent, loyal network he had already built, and the unseen levers of power they now quietly controlled. How does a man speak most clearly from beyond the grave? The silence that greeted Evelyn Reed's team at Arthur Finch's apartment was absolute, a heavy blanket smothering the usual city sounds. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the ghost of brewed tea and the cold, metallic scent of a life concluded. They found Finch in his worn leather armchair, a book open on his lap, the scene a portrait of quiet academic despair. It was all too perfect. The official report would read suicide, but for Reed, the meticulous staging screamed murder. The price of silence, once paid in foreign microdeposits, had been collected in one final brutal payment. This was not an end. It was a message from Julian Thorne, a ruthless move to permanently erase a key witness from the board, the complex web. But Arthur Finch, the reluctant oracle, had saved one last piece of data. On the polished mahogany of his desk, placed with an engineer's precision, lay a single sheet of notepaper. It bore no confession, no apology, no final testament. It held only a sequence of numbers, a cryptic string written in his familiar spidery script.
This was not the scrawl of a man succumbing to despair. It was the final data packet from a human server who knew his system was about to be wiped. Was this a desperate act of defiance, or the last calculated move in a game he knew he was destined to lose? Today, when secrets are buried under code, a string of digits can be more powerful than a dying confession. This is the new language of the silenced. The note was a warning from the grave. The hunt for Thorne had now become a frantic race to understand Finch's final cryptic puzzle. What if a key isn't a code, but a story already written? The string of numbers from Arthur Finch's note was not a password. It was a map without a known world. In the sterile forensics lab, an analyst stared at the sequence 301146 as his algorithms returned only digital nonsense. For Evelyn Reed, the realization was a cold certainty. Finch hadn't invented a new lock. He had simply hidden the key in plain sight, a ghost from the age of spies and dead drops. The numbers formed a classic book cipher, simple, elegant, and without the correct book, mathematically unbreakable. Each number triplet corresponded to a page, a line, and a word within a specific text. The team now faced an impossible library. They scoured Finch's life for a literary anchor, purchase histories, library records, marginalia. But Finch had been meticulous, erasing his intellectual footprints. How do you find one specific book in a dead man's mind, a single volume among millions? The Watcher's Game. It was a puzzle designed not to be solved, but to be admired.
The frantic search for the correct printing, the one from that specific era, ended in a dusty second-hand bookshop. Back in the lab, a hush fell as they opened the brittle, yellowed pages. 301. Page 301. 14, the 14th line. 6, the 6th word. The analyst typed. A single word appeared on the screen. Then another.
The message from the grave began to unspool, a final move in a game Finch was still playing. The first words were not a confession, but an instruction. Thorn's contingency is. One word was all Arthur Finch's cipher offered. Not a name or location, just a single loaded promise. Sanctuary. For Evelyn Reed, the word was a chilling paradox. A sanctuary is a place of refuge, yet Finch's life was a fortress of paranoia. The coordinates from the book cipher pointed to a ghost on the map, officially non-existent for 30 years, a decommissioned Cold War communications relay buried in the Allegheny National Forest. The drive took 6 hours, the last 2 on unpaved roads that stripped away civilization. Her sat phone died an hour ago, leaving only the crunch of tires on gravel and the wind in skeletal trees. A complex web. She found it at dusk, a concrete scar half swallowed by the earth. A rusted fence, long breached, sagged between leaning posts. Beyond it, a blast door was set into a low hill, its steel weeping orange rust onto the weathered concrete. The air was cold, smelling of damp earth, pine, and the metallic tang of decay. Finch had led her to this concrete tomb from an era of mutually assured destruction. The lock was not electronic, but a massive mechanical wheel. It yielded to Reed's effort with a deep protesting groan of metal, a sound lost to time. Inside, the darkness was absolute, a physical presence. Was this where Finch had hidden his secrets, or where Julian Thorne had buried them? The line between a sanctuary and a prison is often just a matter of who holds the key. These bunkers, monuments to a forgotten terror, still litter the landscape, silent reminders of a world that held its breath. They represent an architecture of secrecy that didn't vanish after the Cold War. It migrated, becoming digital, less visible, but no less potent. The paranoia that poured this concrete now thrives in the hum of server farms and encrypted networks.
Unraveling shadows. Stepping inside, her flashlight cutting a path through the gloom, Reed felt the weight of the earth above. The air was stale, a pocket of time sealed decades ago. Her light caught something on the far wall, not a file or computer, but a single vintage photograph pinned to a dusty corkboard. It was a face from the past, waiting to tell its story. A dead man's final word is not an ending, it is the key. The word sanctuary led Evelyn Reed not to a place of peace, but to a cold concrete box buried beneath a forgotten warehouse. The air inside tasted of damp earth and stale recycled time. Her gloved fingers traced a hairline seam in the wall, a line almost invisible until she pressed, and a section of concrete swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a climate-controlled alcove. This wasn't a shelter, it was an archive, Arthur Finch's last testament sealed against the world. Inside lay the complete anatomy of betrayal. Stacks of hard drives, each labeled with a sub-project codename from the Nightingale era. There were physical journals, their pages filled with Arthur Finch's meticulous, almost paranoid handwriting, detailing every meeting, every morally ambiguous directive he received. And there, isolated from the rest, was a single deceptively thin file labeled simply Thorne, Genesis. It was the Rosetta Stone of the conspiracy, the dictionary that would translate a decade of whispers and shadows into the plain, damning language of treason. The web unravels. The Genesis file contained the first thread. It was not a complex algorithm or a record of a cash payment. It was a memo, dated over 12 years prior, written on official letterhead. In it, a much younger Julian Thorne authorized the use of Nightingale's powerful surveillance tools against a domestic activist group, justifying it with vague national security language. This was not foreign espionage. This was the weapon of the state being turned inward on its own citizens, the first definitive step from protector to predator. How many other lines had been crossed in the name of a misguided patriotism that saw dissent as sedition? What if the enemy you hunt was the machine built to protect you? The air in the sanctuary was cold, thick with the smell of old paper from Finch's archive. Evelyn Reed stared at her tablet, its light revealing a confession, not of one man, but of an entire system. These weren't schematics. They were the project's horrifying charter. Project Nightingale was never a shield. From its first line of code, it was a weapon, its sights aimed with precision at its own citizens, a complex web. The evidence was laid bare in Finch's meticulous logs. Nightingale's primary algorithms were not hunting spies or terrorists. They were designed for an insidious function, ideological cartography. The program ingested voter registrations, forum posts, book purchases, and protest attendance. It built profiles, flagging citizens not for crimes committed, but for beliefs they might one day hold. The goal wasn't prevention, it was the preemption of dissent. The ghost in the machine was not a traitor signal, it was the program screaming its original sin into the void after 12 long years of silence. Finch's files detailed the chillingly automated mechanism. An individual who triggered enough flags was assigned a domestic threat index. This was not a passive score for an analyst, it was an active trigger. A high index initiated a cascade of punitive actions through integrated systems. Loan applications were denied by unseen algorithms. Professional licenses were flagged for endless review. It was a silent, bloodless neutralization. If the state's most powerful weapon is aimed inward, who then is the true enemy? This revelation recast the entire investigation. Julian Thorne was no longer the singular architect of a grand betrayal.
He was merely an inheritor, a user of a system whose rotten foundation was laid long before he arrived. The foreign connection, the mole hunt, all were symptoms, not the disease. The original sin was not selling the weapon to an enemy. The original sin was building it in the first place, to target one's own people, for the crime of their convictions. A complex web. This architecture of control, designed in secrecy, is the dark ancestor of modern anxieties over algorithmic governance and predictive policing. The discovery inside the sanctuary didn't close the case, it blew it wide open. The hunt was no longer for a single traitor. It was a search for the shadow faction that first dreamed of Nightingale, and Finch's final file gave them their first name. How do you fight an enemy that wears your own uniform? The hard drives from Arthur Finch's sanctuary whirred to life, a sound like ghosts waking in the cold, sterile air. Evelyn Reed watched as the first decrypted file bloomed across her screen, expecting a manifesto or a final confession. Instead, she found a list. It was an organizational chart, a roster of names, call signs, and high clearance levels. This was not the work of a single traitor like Julian Thorne. It was the architecture of an institution hidden in sight. The mole hunt was over. A much larger, more terrifying war had just begun. The structure wasn't a pyramid with a single figure at its apex. It was a web, intricate and resilient, with nodes embedded deep within the nation's most trusted agencies. A name from the Treasury was linked to a contact in defense, who in turn had a direct line to a senior policy advisor. They called themselves the Directorate. Each member was a firebreak, insulated from the others, yet all were connected by the insidious logic of Project Nightingale. How do you even begin to dismantle a conspiracy that has no single vulnerable center?
The network was designed not just to operate in secret, but to survive discovery, its tendrils reaching into the very heart of the state. The revelation was chilling. The threat wasn't an external force or a lone operative. It was a cancer that had metastasized within the system itself, using the tools of democracy and security to subvert them. The web holds. This is the enduring fear of the modern age, that the institutions designed to protect us have been quietly, methodically hollowed out from within, leaving only a facade of legitimacy. The names on Finch's list were not shadowy figures. They were decorated public servants, trusted officials, and respected leaders. For Evelyn Reed, the objective had fundamentally shifted. She was no longer hunting a ghost, she was mapping a shadow government. Every name on that list was a new front in an undeclared civil war fought in secure servers and quiet wood-paneled offices. Each name was a potential threat, and each was a potential clue leading further up the chain. But as she scrolled through the dozens of high-ranking operatives, one terrifying question remained unanswered. Who or what sat at the center of the web? What happens when the system you serve decides you are the threat? The data pulled from the hard drives in Arthur Finch's sanctuary was a lit fuse, burning silently toward an inevitable detonation. But instead of an outward explosion, Evelyn Reed felt a sudden, chilling implosion. The first sign was subtle, clinical. Her lead cryptographer, the man who had finally cracked Finch's book cipher, was abruptly reassigned to a mundane counter-trafficking unit in another state. The official reason was a priority shift. Reed understood the coded message perfectly. It was a warning shot fired across her bow. The network revealed in the sanctuary was not just an abstract threat on a server. It was alive, and it had begun to methodically sever her limbs.
She was summoned to a sterile top-floor office, the city sprawling below like an inert circuit board. Deputy Director Evans didn't meet her eyes, his focus fixed on a silver pen he rolled between his fingers. He spoke of budgetary reallocations and personnel optimization, words as hollow as the room's manufactured silence. Her security clearance, once her sharpest tool, was now under procedural review. This was not an investigation, it was a containment protocol. They were not trying to find a mole, they were trying to bury the truth she had unearthed. A complex web. With her team scattered and her access to the Nightingale files systematically revoked, how could she possibly prove a conspiracy that controlled the very tools of proof? This is the timeless defense of entrenched power. It uses the legitimacy of an institution to shield its own corruption from scrutiny. The system protects itself, even from the truth, a lesson as relevant in the corridors of power today as it was in the secret corners of Project Nightingale. The walls were closing in, designed to isolate and discredit her until she was just another footnote in a redacted file. They had taken her resources, her authority, and her credibility, leaving her utterly alone. Just as despair began to set in, an encrypted text lit up her phone from a number she didn't recognize. It contained only 2 words: Finch's ghost. How does an investigator vanish from a world she helped build to watch? For Evelyn Reed, the decision was not a choice, but a final, logical conclusion. The network revealed in Arthur Finch's sanctuary files was not a foreign entity. It was a cancer within her own agency. The low hum of the servers in her building, once a sound of order, now felt like the purr of a predator. She understood. The walls weren't just closing in, they had been there all along. She worked methodically, her movements precise.
A final keystroke wiped her workstation, leaving a carefully constructed false trail. At a bustling downtown bus station, the air thick with diesel fumes, she paid cash for a ticket to a city hundreds of miles in the wrong direction. Her government-issued phone, a lifeline for years, was dropped into a bin, its GPS tracker dying with a final, silent whimper. This was the first step in unwriting herself. The shadow network. The system she served had become a perfect cage, its bars forged from metadata and facial recognition scans. She was now a ghost, but not like the digital specter that started this hunt. She was a ghost by design. When the very tools of justice are corrupted, what does a righteous escape even look like? Her flight is a stark reminder of our own digital fragility, a warning that the systems designed for our security can so easily become our prisons. This is the quiet fear of our hyperconnected age. Every step was a deliberate severing of a tie to the person she had been. She carried only one thing of value, a single heavily encrypted drive containing the core of Finch's archive, the unassailable truth of Project Nightingale. She was not just running away from the threat, she was running toward the one person she believed was truly off the grid. Now her only goal was to reach her old mentor, a man who had taught her that the only real sanctuary is the one no machine can ever find. When the system hunts you, who do you trust? For Evelyn Reed, one name remained from a burned life: David Chen. They met in a diner, the air thick with stale coffee and grease. A Cold War relic, Chen listened as Reed detailed Finch's sanctuary. He nodded. He was not shocked, he was resigned. He called it the permanent government,
an infrastructure of shadows built to survive any political weather, accountable only to its own logic. It was a feature, not a bug. Chen saw its tendrils before, during the last century's wars.
Project Nightingale wasn't an anomaly, he explained, but an evolution. A mechanism born from the belief that security required a hidden hand on the scale. He didn't condone it, but understood the fear that built it. How do you fight a system that believes its survival is the nation's? His help was not about morality, it was pragmatism. He gave her a key, a phone, and some cash. He offered a chance to fight back, a different kind of sanctuary. Their alliance was forged in disillusionment. A veteran and an investigator, united against the state they once served. For the first time since going off-grid, Reed was not alone. The idea of a deep state reflects modern anxiety over opaque power and eroding oversight in an age of total surveillance. The danger is not conspiracy, but the quiet creep of unaccountable control. Chen pushed a napkin across the table. It held one name not in Finch's files. Their first move was now clear. How do you turn a patriot into a pariah overnight? You use her life as the weapon against her. The network unearthed from Finch's sanctuary didn't respond with assassins. They responded with a whisper campaign that roared into a national firestorm. The first strike was a devastating article from a trusted outlet, seeded with half-truths and forged documents. It was a masterpiece of misdirection. A man in a dimly lit apartment stares at his television, the only light reflecting off his glasses. On the screen, Evelyn Reed's official agency portrait is juxtaposed with grainy, out-of-context surveillance photos, a red banner proclaiming "Rogue Agent" scrolling beneath. He had seen her lauded as a hero just months before. Now she was the enemy within. The article cited anonymous sources high within the intelligence community, detailing how Reed had supposedly manipulated Project Nightingale data, framing loyal officers to cover her own treasonous communications.
They used the very evidence she had uncovered, twisting her search for the truth into a narrative of betrayal. The web tightens. The false flag was surgically precise. It used Reed's own meticulous investigative methods against her. Her encrypted messages to David Chen were selectively leaked, stripped of context, to appear as communications with a handler. The money trail she followed from Arthur Finch was re-engineered to look like payments she was receiving. It was a perfect inversion of reality, built upon a foundation of verifiable facts. When the very architects of truth decide to build a lie, who is left to tell the difference? The public, primed for stories of conspiracy and internal corruption, consumed it without question. Her digital ghost, once her greatest asset, was now her accuser. Every erased file became evidence of a cover-up. Every secure channel she used was proof of clandestine activity. David Chen had warned her this was their final, most brutal play. "They won't just kill you," he'd said, his voice a low gravel over their secure line. "They'll erase who you were." This strategy of character assassination is not a relic of the Cold War. It is a cornerstone of modern information warfare, where public perception is the ultimate battlefield. The most effective lies are always those that are 90% true. The network wasn't just hunting Evelyn Reed, they were unmaking her, turning her name into a synonym for treason. She was no longer an investigator, she was a headline, a cautionary tale. And now, completely isolated and publicly condemned, she had to dismantle a lie that had become stronger than the truth. What if the only cure for a disease is a more potent poison? From his penthouse, Julian Thorne watched the city's web of light. He felt no affection, only a physician's cold diagnosis. In his study, surrounded by histories of fallen empires, the distant glow was not a sign of life, it was the flush of a raging fever. To Thorne, the nation was dying, not from an external threat, but from a rot within, a gluttony of comfort, an atrophy of will. He saw treason as a perspective for the weak. His network, the machine Arthur Finch died to protect, was not betrayal. It was a surgeon's scalpel, sharp and unfeeling. Is a doctor who causes pain to save a life a monster, or the one brave enough to act? He viewed the foreign power he courted not as a master, but as a tool, a cauterizing agent to burn the infection clean. A complex web. Evelyn Reed, in her blind faith in the system, was a perfect symptom of the sickness. She was a white blood cell attacking the cure. This chilling ideology, that a nation must be broken to be saved, is not a dusty artifact of history. It is the quiet promise of extremists in our time, who argue the only path to purity is fire. The true danger is not the enemy at the gate, but the self-proclaimed savior within. The false flag that branded Reed a pariah was never the final move. It was the anesthetic before the first deep incision. With the system's best defender now its most wanted fugitive, the board was clear. The real, painful surgery could at last begin. How do you lure a spider from the center of its web? You don't break the strands, you make one of them twitch. In a disused server farm beneath a laundromat, Evelyn Reed and David Chen worked in the cold blue light of their monitors. The air, thick with ozone and a smell of old plastic, hummed with repurposed fans. The data from Arthur Finch's sanctuary cascaded across their screens, not as a static list, but as a living constellation of connections, a pulsating map of Julian Thorne's digital soul. At its absolute center was a single, heavily encrypted nexus, a communications hub so fortified it was a ghost within the ghost network. A direct assault was suicide. The system was designed to self-amputate, cauterizing any breach, sacrificing the node, and erasing every trace of the attack.
They had to make the spider come to them. Their strategy was therefore born from this precise limitation. It was a masterpiece of digital misdirection. Instead of a battering ram, they would use a poisoned morsel of information. They would craft a lie, a piece of intelligence so perfectly tailored to Thorne's messianic philosophy that it would bypass all his protocols and proxies. It had to be irresistible. It would confirm his deepest fears about the world's decay, the very disease he believed only he could cure. A threat so fundamental to his grand design that he could not delegate its verification. He would have to reach for it himself. But how do you craft a lie that looks more real than the truth to a man who sees conspiracy in everything? This kind of bespoke deception is the core of modern psychological operations, where truth is not attacked, but carefully bent to fit a target's deepest fears and biases, the complex web. David Chen, whose experience was forged in an era of dead drops and microdots, understood the classical elegance of the gambit. The bait was a data packet, cloaked as a high-level leak from a competing foreign service. It contained meticulously fabricated chatter about a planned betrayal from within Thorne's own inner circle, a direct challenge to his authority. It was a digital Judas kiss. They would inject it into a low-security peripheral, a forgotten sensor array on the network's fringe, and let the system's own automated protocols carry the poison to the heart. All they could do now was cast the line into the digital dark and wait. They would watch for the subtle tremor that would signal the spider had finally stirred from his lair. The spider finally twitched, but it would not leave its web. It simply invited the fly inside. The message arrived at 2 a.m, a single line of text on a burner phone. The green glow lit David Chen's face as he read, "The Crystal Atrium, noon."
Come alone. It was an invitation and a threat, delivered with the cold efficiency Evelyn Reed now knew was Thorne's signature. His control was absolute. He dictated the time, the place, and all the terms. Unraveled shadows. The Crystal Atrium was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a public building of glass under the constant watch of 1,000 cameras. Thorne wasn't offering a clandestine meeting. He was offering a stage. Reed would be a solitary figure, stripped of anonymity, surrounded by a crowd that was both her shield and her cage. How can you corner a man who uses the public square as his fortress? This was his philosophy. True power is demonstrated in plain sight, a lesson relevant in an age where surveillance makes every life a public performance. The system he built was designed to make everyone visible, except for him. Evelyn Reed understood the game. This was no longer about the data from Finch's sanctuary. It was a final, personal contest of wills. She would go not as an investigator, but as a ghost walking into the sun. Everything now hinged on this meeting in the glass house, a conversation that could unravel the conspiracy or snap the final thread of her life. What if a war is won not with a bang, but with a whisper? Amid the polite murmur of a gallery gala, ice chimes against crystal, a sound masking the silent detonation between them. Julian Thorne spoke of abstract art and national futures, his voice a smooth veneer of control, while Evelyn Reed calmly dismantled his life's work. She began not with the language of treason, but with a quiet inquiry about system architecture, a professional courtesy. She complimented the elegant redundancies of Project Nightingale. Thorne accepted the praise, a faint smile on his lips. He responded with the well-rehearsed philosophy of the reluctant savior, the physician forced to perform radical surgery.
He spoke of pruning a dying branch to save the tree, of a necessary pain for the greater health of the nation. It was the same self-serving logic he had contemplated from his penthouse, a story he had told himself until it became his only truth, the complex web. Reed let his justification settle in the air between them, a poison searching for an antidote. Then she spoke Arthur Finch's name. She framed him not as a victim, but as a design flaw, a variable Thorne had failed to properly control in his grand equation. But when does the physician appoint himself the sole arbiter of the cure, refusing to see the sickness in his own hands? She laid out the truth without raising her voice, a calm recitation of irrefutable facts. The foreign accounts meant to look like Finch's pension, the network of compromised agents, built not on loyalty but on fear. The sanctuary revealed not as a refuge but as the web's very center. Each word was a precisely cut piece of glass, assembling a mirror that showed him not the patriot he imagined, but the tyrant he had become. This is the timeless danger of the ideologue, the belief that a noble end justifies any means, a logic that echoes today in the quiet expansion of surveillance and the justification of preemptive control. It is the sound of freedom being traded for a carefully managed illusion of safety. Reed leaned closer, her voice dropping so only he could hear. She never mentioned David Chen or the server farm beneath the laundromat. Instead, she recited a single forgotten line from a private memo he authored 2 decades ago, a phrase containing the original seed of his entire betrayal, a ghost from his own past. Thorne's placid expression remained a perfect mask, but the champagne in his glass trembled, a tiny seismic tremor betraying the collapse within. The perfect machine had just been shown its fatal error, leaving one question hanging in the air. What happens when the spider is shown he never truly left his own web?
It was not a gunshot, but one keystroke that broke the world. From a server farm, David Chen hit enter on Reed's ghost signal. Arthur Finch's entire unredacted archive, the raw data from his sanctuary, began to flow. Not a leak, but a flood. A wave of classified files and memos aimed at the heart of the network Julian Thorne built. The web unravels. In a newsroom smelling of stale coffee, one reporter saw an alert flash on her secure terminal. A data package arrived without a source, its subject line, Project Nightingale. She watched as file trees populated her screen, names whispered for years, now attached to damning, irrefutable evidence. For the first time in a decade, the silence was broken by the frantic clatter of keyboards. The data rippled outward, hitting oversight committees and intelligence watchdogs simultaneously. The walls of plausible deniability crumbled into digital dust. How can a shadow conspiracy survive in the sudden, blinding glare of absolute transparency? This was Finch's final gambit, a dead man's switch that did not destroy the system, but instead held a perfect, unflattering mirror to its face. This act of digital defiance underscores a modern truth. Information, once freed, is a more potent weapon than any arsenal. The world now had the evidence, the names, the original sin of Project Nightingale laid bare. But as Thorne's machine began to grind to a halt, a new question emerged. What becomes of the ghosts who threw the switch? How does a web built in shadow finally meet the light? It begins not with a storm, but with a quiet knock before dawn. A deputy director, still in his silk robe, answered the door to find 2 agents standing impassively on his porch, the morning paper lying unread at their feet. The lead agent's voice was devoid of emotion as he spoke the man's full name, a formality that hung in the cold air like a verdict.
There was no struggle, only the clink of a coffee cup being placed gently on a marble countertop before he turned to them. This quiet ceremony of consequence was repeated across the capital in dozens of homes and offices. The data from Arthur Finch's sanctuary, released by Evelyn Reed's ghost signal, was not merely an accusation, it was a digital confession for an entire network of influence brokers, intelligence chiefs, and corporate facilitators.
The very secrecy that had bound them together now served as the perfect, untraceable evidence of their conspiracy. The web unwinds. Each arrest was a strand snapping, the complex pattern dissolving into a series of isolated, indefensible crimes. The men and women who had moved nations with a whisper were now reduced to case files and booking photos, their power evaporating under the harsh fluorescent lights of federal buildings. The linchpin, Julian Thorne, was apprehended in his penthouse study, the city lights he so often observed spread out below him like a conquered map. There was no chase, no defiance. He simply closed the leather-bound copy of Marcus Aurelius he was reading and stood. His grand design, his philosophy of a necessary poison, had been reduced to a simple list of felonies printed on a warrant. How do you measure the sound of a nation's trust breaking? It wasn't a single crack, but a million digital whispers growing into a national roar. A junior legislative aide sat alone in a silent Capitol Hill office, the city lights below just indifferent pinpricks. His coffee had gone cold as he watched the name of his mentor, a man he'd revered for a decade, scroll past on a secure feed from Arthur Finch's archive, forever linked to the poisoned well of Project Nightingale. The betrayal felt intensely personal, a sickness in his stomach. The data dump from the sanctuary was not a leak, it was a deluge that washed away decades of lies. News networks abandoned all other programming. Headlines screamed treason.
The initial response from those implicated within Julian Thorne's network was a predictable wall of furious denial, a chorus of no comment and falsehoods. But the data was too specific, too granular, too interconnected. The great unraveling. It showed encrypted payments to shell corporations, clandestine meeting logs from foreign capitals, and operational orders that sacrificed assets for political gain. The public, fed simple narratives, was now forced to swallow a history of complex poison. The web, once an invisible instrument of power, was now hideously exposed for all to see. The initial shock quickly curdled into a volatile nationwide fury. Spontaneous protests, small at first, began to swell outside federal buildings, their chants echoing off marble. Talk radio became a battlefield of conspiracy and outrage. An emergency oversight committee was hastily formed, its mandate to hold hearings and restore order. But in a storm of information where every fact is instantly weaponized by opposing sides, how does anyone navigate toward the actual truth? From her exile, Evelyn Reed could only watch the fire she had started, wondering if the institution she sought to save could survive the cure. The reckoning had arrived, not as a quiet legal process, but as a chaotic public spectacle. Every cable news panel became a star chamber, every pundit a gleeful prosecutor. The intricate, decades-long deceit of Project Nightingale couldn't be explained in a soundbite, yet that was precisely how millions now understood it. This crisis of faith, born from that digital ghost in Sub-Basement 4, became a lasting blueprint for the institutional skepticism that now defines our modern political landscape. The hearings were meant to bring clarity, to separate traitor from patriot. But the first subpoenas were issued not to the powerful men at the top, but to the forgotten architects who built the machine, and one name was on every summons.
What if victory sounds exactly like the silence of defeat? 6 months after the arrests, Evelyn Reed sat across from Julian Thorne, separated by thick plexiglass. The air in the visitor's room was sterile and cold, smelling of disinfectant, a stark contrast to the ideological fire still burning in Thorne's eyes. He was not a broken man. He was a prophet whose prophecies had come to pass. He spoke quietly, his voice a dry rustle. He saw the public chaos from the sanctuary data release not as his defeat, but as his ultimate vindication. "You see now, don't you?" he'd said, a faint, pitying smile on his lips. "You broke the fever, but you're killing the patient." For him, the reckoning was merely a symptom of the disease he had tried to secretly cure. The web was undone, but its architect remained serene, convinced of his righteousness. Was this what winning felt like, listening to the man who nearly destroyed everything explain why he was right to do so? This quiet conversation left a deeper wound than any conflict. The battle was over, but the war for belief, for the very idea of the institution she defended, was now raging inside her. The truth is, once you see the cracks in a foundation, you can never again trust the integrity of the walls. Thorne's legacy wasn't just a collapsed network, it was the permanent installation of doubt in those like Reed, sworn to uphold the system. The question of who truly protects a society and from what now echoes in every secure briefing and redacted report. Thorne's final words to her were not an apology, but a warning, a whisper about a failsafe he called the gardener. What remains when the web is finally torn down? The city breathes again. A street vendor sells hot dogs under a pale winter sun, his breath pluming in cold air, oblivious to the silent war that raged nearby. The arrests are history, the reckoning is for the courts. Julian Thorne's network, once a cancer in the system, is excised.
But its shadow was not born from nothing. It was woven from threads already in the fabric of the state: fear, arrogance, and the logic that a great evil can justify a lesser one. The blueprint for betrayal is a permanent, open-source document. The files from Arthur Finch's sanctuary are locked away, but the ideas they contain cannot be. Thorne saw himself as a physician treating a sick patient with a necessary poison. He viewed patriotism not as loyalty to people, but as a grim devotion to an abstract ideal that demanded human sacrifice. But is his conviction truly so rare? How many others, in quiet rooms of power, weigh that same dark calculus, convinced their cause is just enough to sanctify the means? The complex web was not just one of technology and secrets, it was a web of corrupted belief, far harder to dismantle. This is why the story matters now. In an age of fractured trust, such a revelation does not cleanse the wound, it deepens it, leaving a scar on the public consciousness. It validates the deepest cynicisms about power. Unraveled shadows. For Evelyn Reed, there was no victory parade, only the quiet knowledge that she had stared into an abyss that stares back, an abyss that is a permanent feature of the landscape.